Hello and welcome to Reawakening the Sacred Self, deepening our connection with our authentic soul, where we have gathered together Indigenous elders, wisdom keepers, spiritual teachers, healers, and also inspirational speakers to share their knowledge and insights as to how we can integrate our spiritual practices more deeply, thus deepening our connection with our authentic soul. My name is Frances Billinghurst, your host for and the creatrix of this event, and I'm coming to you from Kaurna country here in South Australia. As such, I acknowledge the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains as being the traditional custodians of these lands upon which I reside. So mani ngā padni everyone, welcome and thank you for joining me. It is a great honour to welcome in my next guest, which is James T. Powers. Thank you, James, for being part of this event.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity, and I love what you're doing. It's the kind of message that needs to get out there.
You're more than welcome, James, and thank you very much for those kind words. So, for anyone who's not familiar with his works, James is a shamanic practitioner and teacher of the Celtic tradition, a historian, archaeologist, author, and retired teacher. He is the author of 5 books, including Shadows over Dawnland and Ancient Wisdom, Modern Hope, Relearning Environmental Connectiveness. James is passionate about helping people to reconnect spiritually and physically with nature and the environment by reopening an ancient spiritual awareness that has been dormant in modern society for so long these days. And the title of James's presentation is Spiritual Connections with the Earth and All of Nature, in particular looking at the Indigenous peoples of southern New England region of the USA, who have had this really deep connection with the earth and the environment since the end of the last ice age. So we're going back some 12,000 years. So, James, I think it would be a fantastic place to start our discussions with you, explaining probably a little bit more about your background and, in particular, what led you to write your book, Ancient Wisdom, Modern Hope, which is really, I guess, the essence of your presentation today.
Yep. Okay, yeah, I'd be more than happy to. And as you said, I'm a retired history teacher and archaeologist, and I currently work as an author, but I'm also the director of a small Native American museum here in Connecticut. It's called the Quinnipiac Dawnland Museum. It's dedicated to the history and story of the people who once lived in this region, the Quinnipiac tribe of indigenous people. Being a shamanic practitioner and teacher, along with those other elements of my background, I have found that people are coming to me more and more with a very deep concern about where our society in general seems to be going. Regardless of the fact that, we in the United States right now, there are a lot of, obviously folks probably follow, there's a lot going on, but the biggest issue is that they feel this very deep disconnect. They go through the motion of their lives, and they're frustrated, and they're not sure where to turn, and they are looking for something deeper. They're looking for somehow being able to make a connection to something greater than themselves, and that usually takes the form of a spiritual quest. And that very often turns into the whole idea of understanding how that is just one element of something greater, and that greater part is the connection to the wholeness of the earth, the living earth. And so that's one of the things I've been doing now for the last 5 years or so, and absolutely enjoying it. Now, in terms of my background as a historian and archaeologist, even growing up, I was always extremely interested in the local indigenous culture. Connecticut, the small state in southern New England where I live, was the site of some of the earliest colonization in the 1630s. And the results of what happened to the local indigenous population, including the Quinnipiac who lived in the area where I am, was just absolutely devastating. Not necessarily because of war, though there was a terrible, terrible war called the Pequot War that involved the English, but because of the introduction of a completely different attitude in terms of how you live, coupled with a 2-year epidemic of smallpox that basically killed 80% of the individuals. And that, my book Shadows Over Dawnland sort of deals with that whole thing and how the people, the Quinnipiac people, tried to rekindle their connection to the universe by trying to bring back their, the balance and harmony that they had always felt between and understood between the physical world and the spiritual world. But one of the things that I found so disturbing about this as an archaeologist and a teacher is the fact that as time went on, the indigenous people of this region just were pushed, so incredibly pushed to the margins through genocide and economic disruption, cultural dysfunction. We still do have indigenous people in Connecticut, and we have 5 tribes that are recognized by the state, and we have 2 that are federally recognized, and we also have a great number, well, I would say probably 5 or 6 other groups that are not recognized by either entity because of politics, but they're still here. So, but what motivated me to write Ancient Wisdom, Modern Hope was actually a hike that I take very often to an indigenous sacred site. It's called the Rock Shelter. It's like a cliff with a overhang in it that had been occupied one way or the other by indigenous people since the end of the Ice Age. And as I was taking that walk one day, we had a tropical storm come through, and it just exploded over us about 2 weeks before that. And then it was followed a week later by this series of really intense thunderstorms and microbursts so that when I was walking on the trail, which is normally a pretty easy hike, I noticed that there were all these trees that had just been ripped out of the ground. And these are enormous oak trees, and some of them had the tops twisted off as if a giant had come through and was deadheading. And I realized, my God, this is not normal. And I started to think to myself, okay, what can I do as based on my background? How can I try to help people understand what the impact of climate change is doing, not just worldwide, but in where we live? And I sat down and I started to write about how the indigenous people in this region, going back to the end of the Ice Age, were able to survive based upon their relationship with nature, and how they had been able to survive going through really massive changes in the climate. Everything from living at one point in a tundra with animals like woolly mammoths walking around to a boreal forest like we have here in North America and Canada and Alaska. And then finally, for about 1,000 years, it was a dry grassland. And then eventually we ended up about 5,000 years ago with the type of climate we have had up until recently, which is a deciduous forest area. And I kept taking a look at, from my archaeological background, what made it possible for these people to survive. And it was the issue came down to the fact that it was their relationship with nature and their sense of being part of nature that really made it possible for them to survive. So that kind of motivated me to write this book in particular. I guess I could say that it was sort of a catharsis for me, because I realized that I was able to merge together a lot of the issues, a lot of the things that I had experience with, not just from the historical and archaeological point of view, but from the shamanic part of view, because I realized it was that spirituality, which Indigenous people here in Connecticut and southern New England still have, that made it possible for them to maintain their connection to nature and adapt so successfully up until the arrival of Europeans. So
thank you very much for sharing. And while you're talking, I can definitely hear like an echo as to what's happened here in Australia as well, especially as you said, when the arrival of the white people, and it's more of the sort of the diseases that they brought with them, because we also had, I think it was the smallpox too, that came down the Murray River system here in Australia, that virtually, I wouldn't say decimated, but nearly decimated the Kaurna people here in South Australia. And also the sort of not understanding, and I don't know if it's the same with the Indigenous peoples in the US, but here every groups of people, we call them countries, or I suppose clans, tribes, they had their own specific region and area. And when the colonialists came, they just saw all the Indigenous peoples as Indigenous peoples and moved them off the lands that they wanted. So we had the Kaurna people being pushed onto someone else's country, which really disconnected their connectedness with the land. And has, I suppose, in a way, if we're honest about it, is one of the underpinnings that we see today, with even within their own people, is there's still this disconnection to their own country due to colonialization as well. And it is uncomfortable, especially from a white person's point of view, to think, okay, it wasn't me personally or my family, but it's like as a collective, I think we need to all acknowledge that and say, okay, now what can we do to move forward? And it definitely sounds like the work that you're doing with the Indigenous peoples in southern Connecticut area, that what you are doing is like either holding the space for their stories to be told, or reminding people that they were here first, and holding space for them. So when we look at our world around us, it's just like, yes, they knew, as you said, for 12,000 years how to survive the changes that we're still fighting over today, whether it's man-made or cyclic, but it's we need to do something.
Yeah, one of the things that we do when we did, and we are currently doing when we created the Quinnipiac Dawnland Museum, is that we certainly use the artifacts that that have been collected over 12, going back 12,000 years. But what we really emphasized was using Indigenous voices. So we worked with Indigenous artists who did original paintings for us, poets, and we have a regular schedule of Indigenous people who come and speak on a variety of topics, which is wonderful. This weekend, for example, we have a woman. She's from the a tribe called the Nipmunk. She's going to be talking about traditional use of herbs. And so we're trying to educate the public that about, number one, how these people once lived, but also how they currently still are living, which is so important. Because I find, and I found this as a teacher, that one of the biggest problems that people have in general is because of that disconnection to nature, there's also a disconnection to place. So when you were mentioning how the people were moved from where they once lived, that's a major problem for Indigenous people, because that's the land of their ancestors. And when the Quinnipiac people, they weren't forcibly moved from here. They ended up with a situation where they could no longer maintain their lifestyle, because they did not want to live like the English colonists, and they began to merge and move away with other groups. And some of their descendants now are as far away as Wisconsin, which is about 2,000 miles away from here. So that's one of the things that I try to work with people on, this idea that even though your ancestors are not from here in New England, or Connecticut. They came from most of this area is populated by people that are either from someplace in Europe or Africa. You still have a connection to that place through your DNA, through who your family is and what that story is. And as a result, I work really hard with people from the point of view of making connections with their ancestors and their ancestral home, which is really sort of an important thing, as well as here. And one of the fun things that I find about working with people here is that I would say 60% at least of my clients I work with at some point connect with an indigenous spirit here, right here in Connecticut, which I find to be wonderful, and they find to be incredibly soothing. And it's like it almost gives them permission to be here, which is really so wonderful. So that's one of the great aspects of doing what I do.
Yes, and I suppose if we look at it and peel back the layers, we're all Indigenous for some lands. And I'm thinking even with my own makeup with so many different, I think I've got about five different, over the millennia, five different sort of lines of people, the European and all around that area as well. But it's just still that connection, and then also connection to where the place that we are today, and also where we were born, because I wasn't born in Australia. But I do find, in order for me to sort of, as you were saying, put down roots, to feel more connected with the land, it is first acknowledging where I am, acknowledging also the homeland where I came from, where I was born, and then my ancestors. And that can take a long time, sort of like working back through the family tree. But it's like, I
Yeah.
think this is the Western mindset, is that we have had this level of disconnection for so long. We're talking thousands and thousands of years, that's our normal. So when we look at Indigenous peoples, it can take a bit of difficulty to understand why, in say a short period of say 200-300 years, why they feel so disconnected. But that's in their living memory, unlike ours. It goes
Mm.
back too long. So
Yeah.
coming back to your own sort of work, I really like the idea how you're helping people to reconnect, to re-establish, even if they would not feel that they're not Indigenous of that land. They are on even a minute level if they're born in, say, America, where you are based. So how do you do that, and why is that? We sort of talked about it. Really, do you feel why that's so important, like having that sense of place?
Well, I think what it does for people is it gives them, um, well, one of the problems with American culture ever since the beginning is that and I'm not sure if it's the same in Australia. We've always been sort of a rootless society. People move everywhere. People have always been moving around, temporarily living. I'm one of the few people I know who's sort of grown up in this general area where I currently live. But one of the things that I try to do with people is I try to give them the sense of belonging. And it's hard for people to gain that sense of belonging to a place, other than through your mental, oh yeah, this is the street I live on, I like this place, I go to this park, that kind of thing. So what I do is an ancient practice that Indigenous people still practice. It's called becoming. And what I try to do is I try to get them to try to make a psychic spiritual connection to something that is of the earth here. It could be something as simple as a stone. I find that most people really connect to the plants, especially trees. And this process of becoming is actually allowing yourself to actually spiritually communicate with this, with whatever it is. And it sounds kind of new age-ish, but it's something that I understood that that my Irish roots and studying Celtic shamanism, they did all the time. And that was one of the things that made them so powerfully connected to where they live. And so people, it's amazing what happens to people. And I've even done it with a little bit with some kids, and it's amazing how quickly they connect to something. It's usually because the indigenous people in this area have always called the stones and the rocks, they call them the grandmothers and grandfathers. And so to introduce it in that way, if that's what they're going to try to connect to, makes a whole different thing. And then they start to realize that, part of our societies, that the problem with our society is that we became disconnected by the idea that we're separate from nature. And that what happens is the reality is they start to realize that they're no longer, that's not the case. The indigenous people here in North America and New England in particular have always taught that people are the newest of all nature, and that everything that exists are actually our relatives and our family, and that we need to try to remember that and treat them the way we would treat family members, the way we would treat any relative, and with respect, and actually with gratitude. And when they go through that process of becoming, it's amazing what they start to feel, and how they start to feel a connection to nature, and the animals and birds and insects and trees. And I mean, it's a beautiful thing to see. Beautiful thing to see. So.
No, I'm really enjoying what you're saying, because it's like you're sort of taking guidance from the indigenous peoples of your land and using that guidance to share with other people to help them reconnect, as opposed to, and I suppose in this day and age, there's that danger of cultural appropriation, but you're doing it in a very sort of respectful way that is helping others to step into that sacred space of reconnection. So there's nothing of sort of like grabbing and taking someone else's practices and saying this is all mine. It's just like reawakening people
Right.
to the sacred connection.
Yeah, because one of the things I realized probably about 8 years ago was that if I was going to become very serious, I'd always had this understood that I had a special gift in terms of connecting spiritually to something greater. And I've worked off and on with some indigenous teachers, but I realized about 8 years ago that I actually had to learn the shamanic practices of my cultural DNA. And that's from Ireland. And so I was able to find this incredible teacher. Her name is Jane Burns here in Connecticut, who is a practitioner and teacher. And I worked with her for over 4 years, so that I could then turn around. And for me, I can see in the indigenous practices corresponding things to the Celtic. And so from the point of view of cultural appropriation, I'm very, very careful about that. And I will always say to people, this is an indigenous practice, but, and explain the reasons why, because it really is more than just, okay, this is the Quinnipiac's practice. It's a human practice. And it's something that all our ancestors practiced and lived before the creation of state religions and governments and all that sort of thing. And it really is a return to who human beings have always been. And I think that I just love the ability, the opportunity to do that for people, to help people see that. So
Yes, and sort of reminding us that it's not a foreign practice for us. She said people were feeling, especially in the Western world, feeling this disconnection, and this is one of the reasons why is because as a culture, as a Western culture, a mindset, we have disconnected ourselves. So we need to, and we've also lost our own practices for the most part. So once we sort of sit in circle, and even just some of the basic techniques that Indigenous peoples are still using today, then we can, as you said, tap into our own sort of ancestral memory as to what our own ancestors did as well, and thus something else. Right. And you sort of talk about this in the second part of your book, Ancient Wisdom, Modern Hope, where you sort of explain some of these techniques and spiritual practices. So I suppose in a Western mindset where we've been so disconnected for so long, how can we start? I know you sort of explained some of it already, like getting out in nature, but say for the more city-bound people, how can we start bringing in, incorporating some of these techniques? And I suppose it's more than just physical techniques, it's also a shift in our mindsets as well. Understanding that we are part of a greater whole. How can we bring these back into our modern day lives?
We're lucky to have access to a lot of wonderful Indigenous teachings from this area, and not just this area, but across the United States. And one of the things I love seeing is the fact that Indigenous people are now reclaiming their culture, reclaiming their, what really has made them who they are. And so these teachings, I included a lot of them in there because it's something that people can actually start to apply. The Indigenous people from this region had a word, I guess, it's translated in different places in North America, but it's called Wendigo. And Wendigo is it's like a virus that changes somebody into a greedy, selfish manipulator. And one of the things that I realized early on as a historian, when studying when the English first came here, that's exactly what the native people said. Oh my gosh, they got Wendigo, which is, they're cutting down all the trees. And the part of the issue was the fact that one of the major teachings that Native Americans have always taught is that you only take and use what you need. You don't over exploit. You don't look at everything as a commodity, but we rather as something that is life sustaining and life fulfilling. And the other part of that whole idea is that if you only take what you need, you don't use everything, but you just take just what's what you need. Well, let me back up. You leave more for others. And for example, they used to always say when harvesting wild plants, for example, you make sure that you don't take the first one and you don't take the last one, so that things are always sustainable. And so people ask me, well, okay, I live in an apartment. How am I going to practice that? And I say, when you go to the store, really, we overconsume constantly, whether it's food or anything else, and start to think about, well, first of all, what you really need, number one, and number two, the other thing is, where is this coming from and how is it made? Which makes a difference. Now, of course, that gets to be a problem for some people from the point of view of economics, because if you start to think about that, that kind of choice usually is more expensive. However, you will find that you're actually taking less. So there's a bit of a balance there. So that's one of the really important lessons that Indigenous people have passed down to us. There's a whole thing called the honorable harvest that talks about all these different elements associated with, just making sure that what you do and what you take is you leave what's sustainable and you only take what you need. which is such an important element. And then another thing that I find just fascinating, and this always freaks out people here in the U.S. because when it comes to planning, we're usually 2 days ahead, and that's it. We don't think about the future much. Whenever a major decision would be made, and the Indigenous people still say this today, you think about the impact that's going to have for the next 7 generations. And it's just, when you think about that kind of thinking in terms of sustainability for life, it's just an amazing idea that they have to go with. So yeah, there's so many of those little teachings that are really a remarkable thing. But also, one of the most important things, and one of the things I try to teach people in my practice, is that Indigenous people approached everything from the point of view of gratitude. That you were grateful for everything and anything that you were given by nature, and or in life, and also the concept of reciprocity. That you always made sure that in taking something, you were thankful. And so one of the practices that I try to teach people is that, if leave a little offering or just a little prayer or something, just to sort of acknowledge, even when you're going to have a meal, for example, take the time to think where that food came from. Thank the plant. Thank, if it's an animal, thank the animal. Thank the farmer. Be thankful and think about what you have the opportunity to enjoy and use, which is such an important thing. And I find it starts to change people's whole approach towards everything, which is absolutely wonderful. So
Yeah, I'm just thinking, imagine if all our sort of country leaders thought the impact of their decisions that would extend out to 7 generations. It would be a completely different world. And I'm thinking especially here as they give out, licenses left, right, and center, and because they're just sort of this commercialistic, consumerism driven, and it's just like, yeah, because that's all just here and now. We're not thinking longer term, and as you said, we're not thinking where these products are coming from or how they are made as well. It's just all to be seen. It's all very superficial. I keep coming back to the word that you mentioned right at the beginning, this disconnect, that we are not part of nature, and it's actually adding to our own sort of mental health and how we're not coping with
mm-hmm.
the outside world, because we can see this destruction around, but we're not admitting that we're all part of the problem, but we're all can be part of the solution as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, because it's just I find it to be, as I've gotten older, it's so frustrating. And I have grandchildren, and I love them dearly, and I worry about what kind of world they're going to live in, because not just from the point of view of the environment, which is a whole other horrible um, situation, but just in terms of the rampant consumerism that's around them, and that whole culture that glorifies it, and it's just it's hard for my children to and their spouses to work with their kids in terms of well, do you really need that? Just because Susie has it, does that mean that kind of thing? And it's an ongoing battle, and I guess every parent's had that, because that's part of the way our culture is. But
Yeah,
if we start to approach things differently, that hopefully will make a difference for them.
especially as I'm probably very distant from the younger generations, but it seems to be everything's very much on their devices, on Instagram. Everything's very superficial and TikTok and instantaneous, and it's. I mean, I'm just wondering, really, for if there's any influencers who are sort of watching this, maybe consider your own content, and can you use your influence to come back and establish this connection and help your followers to realize that for their own mental health and also for their own, well, the connection with the planet going forward, encourage them to get out in nature and actually get off their devices and change that mindset that everything is visual and, in the astral or external, and actually feel. And I think this is one of the important things too. Everything, as I said, everything's becoming more visual, and we're forgetting how to feel. And that's coming back to connecting in with the land, because that's how we feel. We feel in with the land itself.
It was interesting during COVID, which I'm sure was horrible in Australia too. Um, the only thing that people really could do was to get out in nature and go for a hike in the woods, or go to the beach, or what. It didn't matter what it was, and it was amazing to see that transformation. And it's still there, which I find, where I live, there's a tremendous, it's a lot of forests and hiking trails and, state forests and blah, 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 and all that sort of thing. But it's still amazing to see how many people, especially younger people, are out there. And instead of, doing whatever they would be doing on a Saturday, they're in the woods. I find that to be tremendous. And I think that, that they're appreciating nature more than certainly my generation, or other generations. I think they're starting to get that connection. And I found, as a teacher, I found that many students were incredibly concerned about the climate and the climate change, because it's really been a tremendous change here in New England over the last, I would say, 10 years, 15 years.
Yeah.
So
And we saw the rise, and she's still very much, well, she was, we don't know where she is at the moment, and with Greta Thunberg, and how she sort of instigated the protests that the children were doing. And because that upset a lot of people, they should be at schools, but the whole message was they didn't see the older generations doing anything. And I said, this is our future. And it did shake up a few people, or shake us up for a while, but I think as a human race, we tend to slip back into our old ways very easily, especially in the West. And it's just like, we really need to make more of an effort to reconnect, to look at our footprint basically and what we're actually doing. And as you said, do we need this stuff? So coming back to your background and your expertise in this area, when it comes to sort of, you've mentioned a few things like when we eat, be a little bit more mindful, but are there any other tips or suggestions you can make in order for us to sort of help move our sort of mindset, our modern culture away from this very destructive path that we're living in and what we're seeing around us? And sometimes we can be overwhelmed with what's happening. But on an individual level, what can we all start doing?
Well, it's actually, I was working with a client earlier today, and one of the things that came through the work was the fact that what she does is she tends to compartmentalize everything, and so nothing is really necessarily, she can't see how doing this is impacting that kind of thing. And so one of the things that came through very clear for her was the whole idea, was for her to open her eyes. And by opening her eyes, the whole idea was that to, take a minute and look, but really look. And one of the things that I try to teach people is that, and we do something very often called deep listening, where you just you try to really sort of just stop and pay attention to what the wind is saying, pay attention to what that cloud looks like, pay attention to the song of a bird or a flight of a bird, but you pay attention, and it was quite a revelation for her. And she left the session almost buoyant. She was so excited about the fact that, she kept saying, I just don't do that. I don't do that. And I'll see the world in a whole different way. And I said, yeah, and it's just not your personal life. It's everything. When you go outside, take the time to look at the stars, to look at the trees, or, whatever, and make that momentary connection with them. That will change your whole view of the way life is. So yeah, so it's deep listening and open your eyes. Those are the two things that are really so important for people in our society today. And it's just a little thing that makes such a big difference.
Yeah. I'm sort of smiling off camera while you're talking about the deep listening, because this is the Aboriginal peoples here have a very similar sort of mindset or process. And there's a word, and I think it's from the Northern Territory area, the top end of the country, called Dunderi. And I don't know, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. And it's this deep listening. It's the being still, or being, I suppose, in the sort of Buddhist teachings, mindfulness. And we've all heard in the West about mindfulness, being present. And we can do that in our modern world, even if we're in the 19th floor of a skyscraper. We can just take a few moments and listen, just be still.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a simple remedy, and it's a beautiful thing. When I try to practice it as much as I can, and very often I find myself smiling, which is, the whole point.
And that can be, as I said, looking at the window and tapping into, maybe you did this when you were a child, looking at the clouds and seeing symbols or animals in the clouds, or listening to the wind through the trees, or the wind on the rain on the roof, or something like that, and just reconnecting back into, I said, our place in nature, because we are nature. We're not separated from it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's I find that we're in a place, even though there's so much trauma and negative energy out there, we're in a place now where I think things are starting to change. And maybe it's one person at a time, but people are hungry. They want something new. They want something different. They want to return to where our ancestors once were, which is that deep connection to nature, and through that each other, and all everything that exists. So it's it's as much as it's a difficult time, it's also a beautiful time.
Yes,
So
and sometimes we need that sort of the big wake up call for us to do it. And I guess what we need to be mindful of is that we can look externally and see what's happening out there. Now, we can't change the whole world, but as you were saying with your client, change yourself, how you perceive the world, how you look at the world, and then that sort of, I like the analogy of the pebble being thrown into a pool of water. And then once we're in that sort of place of sort of change, that we're connecting in with the land a little bit more deeper, then hopefully the people around us start seeing that shift, see the benefits of that, see how in tune we are, or how integrated, how connected we feel, our mental health. Then they will follow the practices, and then the people that they associate will follow the practices. And I think this is how we change the world.
yeah, I
Well,
agree completely.
unfortunately, James, we are running out of time, but I would like to just ask you your books, and we have mentioned only just two of them, the Ancient Wisdom, Modern Hope, and Shadows Over Dawnland. And you have written other books. Where can people find them? Are they readily available, or is there your website? Where
well,
can people reach out to you?
the easiest way, and I hate to say it, but the easiest way is Amazon. I wish that wasn't the case. Locally in here in Connecticut, they can get them at local bookstores. But beyond that, the Ancient Wisdom book, because the publisher is in Great Britain, they could go directly to Moon Books, it's called, and order them straight from that publisher. And they're absolutely wonderful to work with. They're very progressive and very sensitive to these types of topics. So I would encourage anyone, if they're curious to look at this type of thing, that might be a place for people to go for sure. So, but yeah, unfortunately, it's they're not. The publishers will send them, but it's sort of one of those things. And I do on occasion. I have enough to. I do a lot of speaking. So I will haul books around occasionally. And if people really want to, they can contact me and I'll send them something. I purposely kept the price of these, especially ancient wisdom, down low because I wanted people to be able to access it. I think it's more the message than anything else that's so important to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's sort of it. And I'm always thinking of another book. I'm in the middle of one right now that's more of a history, which is fun. But I have another one dealing with shamanic practices in nature in my head, which I hope to get to within the next year or two. So because I find that is really such an important topic that has to get out there. I mean, the local history stuff is fun for me, but I want to get that idea out of what we need to do before it's too late, and it's quickly becoming too late.
Yes, yes. And of course, for everybody who's watching this, you can see or have James's link to his web's page below, and you can have a look to see what he's doing, when his new books are coming out, and also I'll also link to Moon Books or Collective Ink in relation to ancient wisdom as well.
Yeah.
So, as I said, James, it's been an absolute delight to have you here today. And thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and reminding us how important it is to reconnect basically to the lands upon which we reside, regardless of whether we are Indigenous of it or not. So, thank you once again.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate like I said, the opportunity to do this. Anytime I can talk about this, being a former teacher, I could talk forever. So, and also people yell at me at times because they say, that's the Irish in you, Jim. And I say, yeah, I guess it is. They say, you have the gift of the gab. So thank you very much. I appreciate being on. And I think this project that you're doing is just absolutely wonderful. I can't wait to see it all come together.
Oh, thank you very much.
Oh.
And don't forget to catch James and go through his website. And to everybody who is watching this, Natalia, thank you. I do hope you have enjoyed this discussion with James T. Powers as much as I have. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Okay.
Blessings.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.